Okay, so I'm briefly going to introduce our speakers to you in the order in which they're going to speak. So first we have Dr. Natascha Drubek-Meyer, who is a guest professor of the Funde Foundation at the Freie Universität in Berlin, where she teaches at the Peter Zonzi Institute of Comparative Literature. Natascha is editor-in-chief of the online journal Apparatus, Film, Media and Digital Cultures in Central and Eastern Europe, which is a multilingual, peer-reviewed, open access journal. Natascha's most recent monograph, Films on Destruction and Liberation, which was published in 2020 in German, focuses on the first Eyed film recordings in a liberated German camp made in the summer of 1944. Natascha is the co-editor with John Lehman Riley and Irina Shulsky of a compilation of responses to DAU, which was published in Apparatus number 10 in 2020. Welcome, Natascha. Our second speaker is Professor Birgit Beumers, who is Professor Emerita in Film Studies from Aberystwyth University. She's taught at Cambridge and Bristol and is currently the chair in Slavic Studies at Passau University in Germany. Birgit is a specialist in Russian culture, cinema and theatre, and the cinemas of the former Soviet territories, especially Central Asia. She's published widely on Russian and Central Asian cinema, and her books include A History of Russian Cinema, 2009, A Companion to Russian Cinema from 2016. She's the editor of the book series Kino under Bloomsbury now, and of Kino Sputniks under Intellect, and also of the journals Kino Kultura and Studies in Russian and Soviet Cinema. And Birgit is published on DAU in Kino Kultura. Third, Eugénie Zvonkine, who is senior lecturer in film studies at the University Paris VIII, Paris 8 in France. Birgit is a specialist on Kira Muratova and Alexei German, and has co-edited with Birgit a book on contemporary Russian, ruptures and continuities in Russian and Soviet cinema, and has also co-edited a book on contemporary Russian cinema, edited a book rather on contemporary Russian cinema. She has published numerous chapters in books and journals, and has written on DAU in Kino Kultura, and also in a book entitled Cinema, Post-Cinema, Cinema in the Post-Art Era. Thank you, welcome. Fourthly, my UCLC's colleague, Michał Murawski, who is an anthropologist of architecture and lecturer in critical area studies at UCLC's. Michał is the author of The Palace Complex, A Stalinist Skyscraper, Capitalist Warsaw and a City Transfixed, from Indiana University Press, 2019. And he's currently writing a book on architectural aesthetics and politics in Putin-era Moscow. In 2018, he co-curated the exhibition Portals Zaryadia, featuring 18 new works by artists exploring the relationship between architecture, politics, and ecology in contemporary Russia, which was held at the State Shusov Museum of Architecture in Moscow. And last, but definitely not least, my other SSEES colleague, Phil Cavendish, who is reader of Russian and Soviet film studies and co-chair of the Russian Cinema Research Group. Phil has published widely on various aspects of Russian and Soviet cinema, both historical and contemporary, with particular emphasis on issues relating to film aesthetics, the relationship between cinema and related visual art forms. His monographs include The Men with the Movie Camera, The Poetics of Visual Style in Soviet Avant-Garde Cinema of the Silent Era from 2013, and Mainstream Soviet Cinematography, The Silent Era from 2010. Phil's most recent publications have been devoted to the development of colour in the Soviet Union during the 30s and 40s. I realise I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rachel Morley. I'm Associate Professor of Russian Cinema and Culture at UCLC's and co-chair of the Russian Cinema Research Group along with Phil, and I'm going to moderate the event tonight. So without further ado or waffle from me, I would like to introduce Dr. Natascha Drubek-Meyer for her thoughts on and responses to DAU. Thanks, Natascha.
Thanks a lot, Rachel, for inviting me in a friendly introduction. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so as a scholar of film studies and Eastern European studies, I'm interested in the process of how a film is made and why, where the money comes from, what happens before, during, or after the production, how the casting happens, who is credited. This is just maybe give you an idea of what I have been researching in the last 10 years, it is actually a part of production studies, a not very pleasant part very often, but it is a legitimate field of film studies. And I have come to the conviction that one should not seriously even start analyzing film content, film style, film aesthetics without paying attention to their production conditions and the backgrounds I just mentioned. Due to the languages I speak, should I say, regrettably, I have become a specialist in a peculiar segment of film production studies in Central and Eastern Europe. That is, films made under duress, actors arrested right from the set and whisked away to the Gulag, Nazi documentary films based on forced labor of those called racially inferior, be it Roma or Jews. You might have heard of the court case against Leni Riefenstahl, the German filmmaker, not that long ago, actually. It was finished in 2002 only. During the war, for her film production, Tiefland, she borrowed Romani actors from labor and concentration camps near Salzburg and Berlin, and later claimed that the actors who she borrowed from the camps loved the work and that they all survived. This, of course, was not true, because many died in Auschwitz. Or the other example from the same period, the Jewish architect František Zelenka from Prague, who did not survive his stint as a film designer in the Nazi ghetto of Theresienstadt, because after the filming, he was deported on one of the last transports to Auschwitz shortly before the gas chambers were shut down. These might seem extreme cases. However, recently, I researched another film from my area, this time further east. It was Tarkovsky's film Stalker, which was made in the late 70s. And Stalker, you might know, is a film Tarkovsky himself called Cursed, The Curse of Stalker. And it seems that the filming itself led to the death of many of the participants later on. And Tarkovsky and his wife themselves died probably of the polluted set. So what are we to do with film material, or the films, in some cases, actually quite beautiful films, which came out of productions of that kind? This leads directly to questions of the ethics of filmmaking, and whether a director or a producer or both have a responsibility for the film they make, in the sense that they are responsible for the future life of participants, and until when this would extend this responsibility. But today I will mainly speak about my attendance of the screening of one of the DAU films. It's called Die Generacja, or Dead Generation, at the Berlin Film Festival. This was in February, probably my last cinema visit before Corona hit. Okay, so I'm sitting in a cinema in former West Berlin, and I'm watching Dead Generation. And I was quite satisfied to be immersed in this conventional film experience, which took over 5 hours and ended after midnight. Only one scene I felt uncomfortable with, but it was possible to suppress this feeling of disgust, about which I will speak later. After this feeling of disgust, I immersed myself again in the narrative and tried to follow the film until the end. I was intrigued by the theory of the collapse of a closed system of information, in this case, the Soviet Union, as a proponent of open access to the products of our knowledge factories, that is the universities, I was amused and tickled by the professor explaining his theory to a KGB officer on a blackboard. It reminded me of attending classes given by the Moscow Tarty School scholars in Munich during Perestroika when I was a student, such as Yuri Lotman. I wondered how they could resolve the combination of this type of semiotics of culture, in fact, a deciphering of codes, and not only the cultural ones, but also the political and historical ones, with an analysis of the history of the USSR and the ridiculing of the idea, and now it comes, of women's rights. In fact, the collapse of the institute in DAU and the whole empire 2 decades later happened because a woman insisted on her right not to be harassed by her boss, who happened to be a communist. And he was replaced by a KGB man. What a strange turn of the story. Once deciphered, how does it play out on the allegorical level? Did the USSR collapse because a woman complained about unwanted sexual advances leading to the fall of her boss, which would never have happened anyway in the Soviet 1960s? So back to what actually made me uncomfortable while I was watching the film. You probably can guess. It was not the killing of the pig, which I have to admit left me cold, but rather the neo-Nazi. I didn't know even who it was when I was watching it, in bed with probably I should say a girl, she was not even a woman, and the camera patiently recording this act of not very good, but authentic sex. In the cinema, I thought, why is she letting this happen? Knowing that actually she could have walked from DAU, from the institute, she could have left. Maybe not from the bed in that moment, but still this was what I was thinking because I knew about the production conditions. Further, I was tormented by the question, why is the camera filming this for such a long time? And why am I watching it? And why are we all letting this happen in the cinema? I try to rationalize, is it an allegory of the whole production process? Perhaps. But then suddenly I thought, what happened to the girl later? How does she feel today? How does she feel when she sees this scene? Or how does her family feel? Especially when we now know who the guy was she had to be in bed with. As John Lemon Riley wrote for our apparatus survey, quote, professional actors have developed ways of handling what happens on set. Ideally, they can give different readings of the same line. They understand how their physicality interacts with the set and the lighting. They can move at the right speed to hit their mark, etc. They may draw on their memories and experiences as objective correlatives to create the role, but after filming is completed, if they have been recreating traumatic events, they have ways to process those feelings and protect themselves from psychological damage, unquote. This was clearly something which this girl could not. She was totally unprotected. And we can see that in the film, and we are witnesses to this violation. Her body, her face, no matter what kind of contract she signed. Signing this type of paper and later having sex with somebody like Tesak seems an unforeseeable and deplorable accident, but it still happened. It cannot be undone. And perhaps this is when, if you watch the film Compliance, the girl even thought at that time that she has to go through with it and that she complied. She was taken in. After all, she's the chosen object of desire of this alpha male in the institute DAU, and she applied to be in that institute. I would say in this situation, she's literally bounced into compliance. John compared it to the famous scene in Bertolucci's The Last Tango of Paris, where today we still cannot know whether it was not rape after all, although recently somebody said, yeah, nothing at all happened. Of course, it was one of the men there. We cannot ask Maria Schneider, because she died, but she certainly felt abused, and it had a certain impact on her career. She might not have chosen if she had the choice. With Tessac on the set in DAU, clear nobody had the courage to resist him, I gather. Who is Tessac? Here, I quote from a book on vigilantism. Maxim Marcinkiewicz received 3 prison sentences for inciting racial or ethnic hatred. Tessac was first indicted in 2007 after disrupting political debates by performing the Nazi salute and yelling Sieg Heil at the book club Bilingva in Moscow, where Tessac asked if everybody agreed that in order for Russia to improve, every Democrat needed to be killed, etc., etc. Some people in the book club wanted to call the police, but the police in the end was not called. Eventually, the host of the debates, Alexei Navalny, submitted a letter to the Russian prosecutor's office. So I assume that probably our directors have found out about Tessac just in connection with this quite famous incident. But this is not enough. In 2009, it turned out Tessac was also a filmmaker himself. He was sentenced to 3 years for making a video with racist content. Following his release from prison, Tessac was unemployed, posted vlogs, video vlogs, and made a living by charging others for joining his hunts for pedophiles, which he called safaris. In the autumn of 2013, Tessac was indicted again for releasing new videos featuring racist remarks. This, of course, is after his participation in DAU. So DAU did not change anything. It was just a very short episode in his very colorful life. As a result, in August 2014, he was sentenced again to prison. And as you all might know, he died in prison in September this year. We don't know quite why, whether he died by suicide, as the prison says, or whether he died in a different form, or whether it was something people on the internet called that he was Epsteined. Important now, and this is the last thing I would like to mention, is that Tessac in 2006, together with 20 other people who were dressed as members of the Ku Klux Klan, staged the execution of a Tajik drug dealer and filmed this incident and released it on the internet. It's not clear until now whether this was a mock execution, as people thought back then, or whether it was a genuine murder, to which Tessac, before his death in prison, confessed. Do we know that this was in fact true? I do not care. I think it is out of the question that a person like this is invited onto a set where non-professional actors work. And I just have to ask myself, what would have happened if Tessac had killed somebody on the set? After I had visited the film at the Berlinale, and after I had seen the directors, the 2 men, Ilya Permyakov and Ilya Khrzhanovskiy, I decided to start a survey for apparatus. But I have to say that I feel totally, I feel that the films on the internet are mostly very difficult to watch. And after having even paid the €3 for one film, I felt somehow complicit in the whole project. So I couldn't do it anymore for a second time. And I would just like to hear what the others think about this, and whether I'm the only person who is that unhappy about this whole project DAU. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Okay, so we're now going to move to Birgit with her contribution. Birgit, when you're ready. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you also for your earlier introduction. Yeah, that leaves me in a sort of difficult starting position for my talk, but I'm going to start by saying that I'm going to strip, not myself, but I'm going to strip down the film and see where it started and try and see the skeleton and put a couple of rags, 3.5 to be exact, on it. So I'm going to use a few slides. If I can find them. Yep, that's looking good. So I'm going to stay in this mode because my experience tells me that it usually takes a while for, there we are. It takes a while for the slides to move, and it takes an even longer while for the slides to move when you are in slideshow mode. So I want to start by talking about my film experience, because I think, or my project experience, because I think all of us will have different experiences and will have seen different things in different ways and different times and different places. So first of all, I start with the very beginning. I have known Ilya Khrzhanovskiy and his work from the very early days. I knew about the project. I know his father, and have, over the course of these 15 or 18 years, however long it has taken him to complete the film, heard at various points what he was doing, where he was, how the financing was going or not going, how much finance he has received. And this is indeed a very interesting and a very important aspect, but one that I've already talked about many, many years ago, long before the project was finished, because a lot of the funding that was pumped into the project was then withdrawn because the process of completing was taking so long that everyone had fallen asleep, including the banks and the financiers who had supported it. So I should begin with the question of what is this thing called DAU? On the one hand, it is, or it was, a film about Lev Landau, DAU, scripted by Vladimir Sorokin, if we remember that for a moment, based on the memoirs of Kora Dobrantseva, Landau's widow, wife, and production started in 2006 or thereabouts. So if we are talking about a film, then I think we can actually stop that talk right now, because a film it is certainly not. We continue in another phase, which is the experiment at the Kharkov Institute of Physics, which lasted for 3 years and involved Khrzhanovskiy rebuilding an institute and inviting people to live there under the conditions of the Soviet regime, let's say, to stay very broad, of somewhere between the 1950s and the 1960s. So we are covering a whole range of years of Soviet history. Once the project was complete and presented, we are no longer dealing with a film, we are no longer dealing with an experiment, but we are dealing with what Khrzhanovskiy himself has apparently called a multidisciplinary anthropological cinema art project. That probably is as closest as you will ever get to a description of what this whole thing involves. So let me begin with the notion of the film. This is not a film. Let me tell you what it is not rather than what it is. It is not a film, it is an event, maybe immersive, and any event needs packaging. At first, when you go through one of those experiences, I think we all find that this is over the top. This is too much. This is really an extravaganza. So let's recap for a moment the various offered experiences that did or did not take place. Berlin 2018. For September of that year, Khrzhanovskiy had planned the launch of his project, reconstructing 800 meters of the Berlin Wall, which was of course not reconstructed, and the project was never launched and started and shown and presented in Berlin. Following that failure, which had to do with the refusal of the municipality, he moved to Paris, where the ambition was to occupy 2 theaters, both under reconstruction, and to connect them with a bridge or a tunnel or somewhat. And of course, no tunnel, no bridge was ever built in Paris. The theaters were both still under reconstruction, and one of the theaters was not opened until about halfway through the run of the project in Paris. There was then supposed to be London, 2020. Supposed to happen in Piccadilly 100, the premises where Khrzhanovskiy had been working on the editing of the film, and that was not open to the public for a variety of reasons which have nothing to do with Corona. In 2019, there was also an attempt to screen the film simultaneously in different halls of the multiplex October during the Moscow Film Festival, but the films, not all of the films got a license for distribution in Russia, and the whole thing collapsed also. So what we have are actually 3 events, 3 ways of packaging something that, in my mind, were completely fluke and completely unnecessary, and none of them worked. So no wonder that a number of critics have been comparing this whole event to a Disneyland or an amusement park, which in fact one could agree with. However, having gone through 1 or 2, actually 3 of the, well, 2.5 of the experiences myself, I have come to make a U-turn on that position of the unnecessary packaging. Why? Because when I hear those of you who have seen a film in a cinema, when I hear voices from people who have seen a film or 2 or 3 or more online, that's all very well. But you do realize that you have only seen a slice, and a very thin slice, of that whole project. So my experience consists of Paris 2019, where I went with a lot of reluctance because I thought this was, as I said, all over the top. And I went through the part of the display of the exhibition of the various booths with footage of the reconstructed Soviet refectory. And I saw one of the films, Smele Ludi. I then was asked whether I would like to come and see more of the films in Piccadilly 100, which is also a venue that is very specific in the sense that you have screening rooms and you sit there on your own and not on your own, because you are surrounded by puppets, by the puppets from the figures of the film who are not real, but then are they real in the film? And what do the films do? What do they represent? So let us look at number 2, the film itself, or films. The group spent 3 years at the Institute. Over those 3 years, only 100 days consisted of filming days. The people who lived in the Institute were notified that on those days there would be a camera, and it is very difficult to imagine how people do not realize the presence of a 35mm array cam, not a digital camera, not a small camera, but one of those clunky things operated by a, yes, brilliant cameraman. So we have at the end of this phase 2, if you like, of the filming, we have 700 hours of footage, some of which need extra sound recordings. So you already have a mismatch of the sound of the voice and the footage that you see. And these 700 hours are in bad need of editing. Into what? And how? Into films for cinemas, into online presentations, into unedited footage, into what and how? Under what aspects? So those are a couple of the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves when we watch the films, because watch them in a particular order is not what the project managers recommend. It's certainly not what I have done for a variety of reasons, but there is a chronology and there is a thematic line that you can follow through when you see the whole range of the films. And I should say that I think both Eugénie and myself have seen all of the films. So number 3 is the question, as you go through that experience, which you know is fake, you are being led into a Disneyland or an amusement park or whatever you want to call it, that pretends that it is Soviet, but it's not. And you can feel it, you can sense it at every single stage. So I feel disappointed. I feel that this is not a kind of documentary thing, but then is it supposed to be that? Is it supposed to be real? Is it supposed to be authentic? Or is it supposed to actually dupe me, to actually cheat me, and to make me think that I'm in the past, but I'm actually in the present? Is it supposed to take me into an era, into a time where a particular system governs, and to show me how people perform in that setting, in that game, how they play along with the rules of the game, and what I do as a spectator, as somebody who watches, who follows, and who is actually very much led into that world. Because when I was watching in London, and you can figure out that we're talking about 35 hours of film for the whole 13 and a half films, it becomes an addiction. You become part of that world. You go home and you think, well, kind of, and what's going to happen? Will I see that person again? Will I not see that person again? So I think we should maybe consider the whole project, and we should maybe consider the experiment that is being conducted before our eyes. If you like, this is a Milgram experiment of sorts, with the same ethical mistakes of not briefing or debriefing people, but it is not a project that is there to reproduce the past, but to replay what happens today when you live under an all-controlling system. And when you throw people in there who are of completely different areas of society and of life. And let me just, to conclude, give you an idea of the range of people involved in that project. So we have, on the one hand, the theater directors Anatoly Vasilyev, Peter Sellers, Romeo Castellucci. We have the performance artist Marina Abramovich and Andrew Ondřejek. In fact, Ondřejek had a fight with, or was involved in a fight with Tesac. We have the conductor Theodore Korensis, who plays Landau. So we have a conductor who plays to be an actor, to play a scientist. In the film, he meets a friend who is an actress, twice Olympic torchbearer, in a scene that is totally unrelated to much of the rest of the events. We have one professional actress who plays Nora. We have various scientists who come to visit from the United States, from all over the world, from David Gross to Jim Fallon. You can read them all up on the DAU website, right down to a number of scientists from Russia. We have various representatives of religion. The shaman Cheltuyev, we have a rabbi, we have a hegumen. We have a number of people who are real people who participate in this project. And we also have a couple of people, a couple of characters who are half made up, who are kind of at the cross-section of the real and the fake, of past and present. Anatoly Krupitsa is an invented figure, loosely based on the physicist Piotr Kapitsa and rendered by Anatoly Vasilyev. We have media artists, we have singers who play roles. We have Olga Shkabarnaya, who is indeed a former porn actress and model, who is now, after the DAU project, changed her career and become a climbing instructor. And in fact, she's married to Dmitry Kaledin. They have met on the set. So there is almost a continuation of this world, this fake world that has been created for the period of 3 years. And we have, of course, the KGB officer, Vladimir Azhiko, who used to be a prison guard and presidential advisor on amnesties, the Ukrainian president, who died actually during the completion of the project in London. So we have, even when we look at the participants, and I don't want to call them actors, we have a group of people who live and who represent that crossover between the real and the fake, and between that experiment with power. And I think that is precisely where I would like to stop. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Birgit.
And I need to stop share my screen.
Yeah,
Yes,
that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker then is Eugénie Zvonkine. Over to you, Eugénie.
Oh, thank you. So thank you very much, Natasha and Birgit. I think it's a kind of a perfect introduction because I don't think nowadays we can speak about DAO without questioning the ethics of the project. And we know that a lot of questions have been raised around this project of this aspect. And also, Birgit, thank you very much for kind of making this perfect way of questioning the origins and the transformation of the project. So I hope it will facilitate what I will try to say today. So I will try also to share my screen if I manage to do that. Yes. So here we go. Yep. So with the small quote from Krupica that Birgit mentioned earlier, I am very much excited by the unfinished artworks. So I will try to address first the question of what is this, just as Birgit was asking, is it cinema, is it post-cinema? So as Rachel has told already, I have written a paper for a volume on post-cinema, where I kind of try to link this project to this idea of post-cinema. But my argument was rather than that through something that in appearance resembles a lot post-cinema, I think that really Khrzhanovskiy strives and desires cinema in a rather classical way and really fiction cinema. As we already said, there is this vastness of the project that would kind of immediately qualify it as post-cinema because one spectator cannot grasp it. As we already said today, each one of us has a different experience of watching DAO. So Anton Dolin talked about the legendary vastness of the project, which is overwhelming and annoying, end of quote. So as we know, there is the 13 films, which are numbered from 2 to 14, which means that there is DAO 1, which is not made or not completed at present. I don't know if there is enough material to complete it, but I think I'm the only one here who has been privileged to watch kind of a 15 minutes trailer of it. So there are some images which I think are the images of the initial project, which was scripted by Sorokin, and that Khrzhanovskiy kind of abandoned when he decided to make the Kharkov Institute experiment. And added to all this, when we were in Paris, there were the 2 theaters where you could watch these films. And moreover, there were films, but there were also series, 3 seasons of series, in which each episode was at least half an hour. So I've watched kind of 1 or 2 episodes just to get an idea. There were also small films of scientific exposés or artistic experiments, which were from 13 to 60 minutes, 30, sorry, to 60 minutes, it depended. And of course, there were the 700 hours that you were supposedly able to watch in the video booths, which were underground in the theaters. I don't think there were really 700 hours, because when you watched the material in there, it was kind of rough, but it was already edited. So I don't think it's the real 700, but I think there was a lot. But I, just for amusement, I counted the hours of opening of the project in Paris, and it was 600 hours, sorry. So anyway, even if we stayed in there 24 hours in a row, didn't stop to eat or sleep, it is physically not possible to watch all of it. And I think it's really the idea. So the first thing that the project does is to kind of put us critics and spectators in a necessarily biased, because incomplete position, and to kind of challenge our position of judging, of appreciating the oeuvre, because no one has seen it all. No one can talk about all of DAU. So it's always about your subjective experience of it. Then the other aspect, which I think also made this project inflate in this way, was this idea of Khrzhanovskiy, that he was not okay with choosing one axis or one approach, which you normally do when you make a costume piece or a period film. So there's a quote I quite like of, so if I manage to show you, yeah. Here it is, by Khrzhanovskiy. It's from 2009, and he said, "Everything is more important to me, all of it together. Politics, physics, physiology, psychology, everyday life, metaphysics, love, friendship, happiness, unhappiness, career, big discoveries. Talent is a blessing, talent is a curse. In cursed times, the problem of choice, the destiny throughout history," end of quote. So there's this idea that he refuses to choose one axis, and so the project contains all of it, and then you kind of make your own way inside of it, and you try to get an idea of some of the topics. Now I want to challenge a little bit this idea that it contains all of it, and he refused to choose. At some point, he said several times that he refused the name of director because he did not direct, but he said, I'm the manager of the project. But I do think that there was all the communication around the project, and then there was the films. There were, sorry, the films when you watch them, really. And quite quickly you can realize that these films are made in a quite a classical fictional manner, many of them, not all of them, but many of them. And I would say that there is clearly a lot of improvisation on the set, but the editing of the chosen films to be the films, not the series, but the films of the project is striving for coherence, for fictional coherence throughout this sometimes somewhat chaotic maybe experience. And also, I think that Khrzhanovskiy actually continues here a trend in directing, in actors directing, that we really know throughout cinema history, which is really to work on putting actors inside a context that will inspire them to be the most authentic in the smallest gestures. So we can see how some of directors we all know have worked for years with some actors, or asked them to, I don't know, to really work in a shop for some time. And here it's the same idea, but actually pushed forward, or pushed maybe further, because now there is a place where you can really stay. And you have, when you say you really have to work, all the actors of the DAU project talked about that the cafeteria girls really had to do the cafeteria girls' work. And the real scientists were invited to make real colloquiums. You know that there are some mathematical and physical papers which have DAU in their thanks, because they really found some things when they were in DAU and they were talking about science. And here's another quote I quite like, and which is actually a quote from 2011, which means that it's when he's still filming inside the institute, but it's rather by the end of the experiment in the Kharkov Institute. So what does he say? To attain the wanted result, I had to invent a special method of the everyday psychological existence, which is to immerse people in a specific context so that the dramaturgical moments seem documentary. You have to work with every artist so that he finds himself inside the circumstances, inside his own nature. From the methodological point of view, these are rehearsals, but organized in an original way. The participants of the shooting consider themselves not as actors in a constructed universe, but as real inhabitants of this new world. So it's very interesting for me because he uses the words rehearsals and artists and speaks about a rehearsal method. So really he works as a fiction director, as a classical film director, but trying to invent something a little bit further than what we're maybe used to put his actors in a circumstance that will allow them to really feel that they are part of this universe. So from the same interview, another quote, which puts the things, I think, even more clearly. And he says, there are a lot of documentary films, but I am making a fiction film, end of quote. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about the film as a screen adaptation, because actually, as Birgit already mentioned it, it's an adaptation of Cora Landau's book, How We Lived. And I read the book and tried to kind of compare or toy with this comparison, even though it seems completely disproportionate. And I would say that the films are much more an adaptation that we could think. Many characters, many relationships are quite close to the representation of Landau's universe as it is accounted by his wife, not by other witnesses of this time or of Landau's life, but specifically how it is described in this book. And I would say there's another quote that I really like about how he got inspired by literary texts, and also maybe an explanation of why he wanted to invent this new method and this Kharkov Institute. So he says this. I'm sorry for putting the quotes, but since my English is not very good, this way you can just get the quotes for you. Once I read the epilogue by Kaverin. There is an episode in the book. Once he came to Sitenyanov. His windows overlooked a small, deep, pit-like courtyard. Tenyanov came close to the window and asked him, "Don't you find the air strange? There was a slight fog in the yard, like a faraway fire, with its smoke brought here by the wind." Tenyanov said, "People are burning their papers. Burning letters, diaries, documents, photographs, archives, a small courtyard, many windows, many doors, and behind all these doors, people burn papers, destroy any traces of their lives. How can one convey this? This air in which people used to live, not 1 or 2 days, but years, decades, and eternity." End of quote. And of course, this reminds us of this great book titled by Alexei Yurchak, and everything was forever until it was no more. So after that, we can understand that there is the idea of not specifically reproducing one era, and we know that there are a lot of historical discrepancies in the era reproductions in DAU films, which were pointed out by many historians and film critics already, so I'm not going back there. And I would rather tend to agree with Birgit. I think the point is not specifically putting us back in these eras, but rather questioning what it is to live in a closed society that would reproduce this kind of rules. And so how to do that? And I think that's one of the reasons why the idea of the institute was put in place. I also think that one of the goals of these films, or of Khrzhanovskiy more largely, is to all the time toy or question our idea of what fiction or reality or documentary is, because the answer is never easy in these films. For instance, there was one thing I thought was really very interesting. So he decided to keep in these films the moment where Landau experiences his accident, which deprives him of almost all of what he is. And this is quite interesting because in the films, it's not Landau anymore, it's DAU. So we know it's based on DAU, but it's not him. So he could have abandoned this fiction, this specific biography trend that he experienced this accident, but he doesn't want to abandon it. So he is close to the book here. And now he has two choices. Either he asks Kurensis to play a diminished man, or he takes another actor to be this, who is really diminished, to be this second DAU, the DAU after the accident. And in both cases, there is a problem, because if it's Kurensis playing, then it becomes obvious that all of this is, of course, completely fiction and not at all authentic. But if he takes another person who is the new DAU, then it's also clear that this is fiction, because it's not the same person anymore. So his choice was the second one, because for him, I think the authenticity of the body is more important in this instance. But anyway, we can see how a lot of these questions are asked and with no simple answer, I think. But now I will also just to conclude, maybe I wanted to put it out there, this idea of his heritage of the maybe Soviet cinema. I think it's not only Soviet cinema, of course, but I think it's there still. So I think what he inherits from, for instance, Tarkovsky. I think it is very good that Natasha talked about Tarkovsky earlier. I found this very interesting text written by Khrzhanovskiy about his admiration of Tarkovsky. And he said that he did not admire him as that much for his style, but I quote, "For me, the scale, masштаб, on which Tarkovsky developed these themes and topics is important, is indisputable." So I think what he really inherits is this idea that he has to make something that would impact, change the face of contemporary cinema, that would really mark an epoch. So this idea of scale, of masштаб, which I think produced this kind of overwhelming project, is actually quite openly, I would say, an inheritance from the Soviet cinematographers in some way. And then just one example, maybe because we could take more, but just one example I wanted to put out there, the animal cruelty we talked about. And actually we could try and have a thread here. I would start with Stachka by Eisenstein, of course, with this, you know, the cow. And I will quote Eisenstein, who says that why did he put these frames in there? He wanted, he says, to inject a maximal effect of bloody horror by, I quote again, close-up shots displaying the true horror, реальный ужас, of the slaughterhouse with the throat cutting and the skinning of the livestock. Okay, there is another director, Tarkovsky again, who also was infamous, as you know, for having burned a cow. Well, not really burned a cow, but put something that burned on a cow that was supposed to go to the slaughterhouse later on in Andrei Rublev, which was a very scandalous episode. And you know that there were articles out in the press, and the film was almost not released because of it. And here it's just one of the papers, but I actually found the explanation of the artistic crew of why they would put this there. And it's also very interesting. And they explain that they need this kind of real, authentic horror to depict something they cannot show, which is the horror of the Vladimir takeover by the Tatars. So they cannot show the real horror of people killing people. So animal cruelty will kind of stand in as a metaphor. Another example would be, I think, Elem Klimov's "Иди смотри," come and see, with also real killing of a cow, as we know. And of course, I'm coming to our, oh, sorry, oops, here, pigs. I don't have the image of the slaughtering of the pigs in Degeneration that was already mentioned by Natasha. But what I think is quite interesting is that even though this project DAU states in the communication that it is very authentic, we can see that actually Khrzhanovskiy not only inherits some trends, but also, I would say, faces the same dilemmas or challenges that his predecessors in traditional fiction film, which is in Degeneration, we see the destruction of the institute and the killing of all the protagonists, but we cannot show the killing. And of course it is staged and we can just see the people playing dead. But at some point, maybe he wants to put something shocking, something more authentic. And so he uses the same procedures as were used in by previous film directors in this kind of thread I suggested today. So I stop here and I stop sharing my screen and I'm done.
Thank you, Eugénie. Okay, next up is Michał.
Unmute myself. Thank you, Rachel. I think I'm sharing the wrong screen.
Not sharing anything yet.
Am I sharing?
There we go. No, I can see it now.
The title slide, right?
Yeah, the title.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel and Phil, for the invitation. And I'm also very kind of humbled and nervous, as I'm the only non-film scholar in the room, in the virtual room. But I'll do my best to deliver some perspective from my point of view. In my trawl through a decade's worth of commentary, news, and hearsay about DAU, kind of written in multiple languages, I've been guided and assisted by two things: by the fact that I'm focusing on the architecture and set design of the project, conceived in consultation with Khrzhanovskiy by the otherwise almost entirely unknown artist and set designer Denis Szybanov. Szybanov designed the set of every aspect of the DAU project in Kharkiv, as well as the 2019 release in Châtelet and the interiors of 100 Piccadilly, the project's long-term HQ in London. He's also apparently de facto designing some elements of the set of Khrzhanovskiy's current Gesamtkunstwerk, the Babyn Yar Memorial Project in Kiev. And somehow almost nothing has been written about Szybanov and his work on DAU in English at all for the entirety of the last decade, although a fair amount of information is available in Russian and some in German. Secondly, what I'm writing, what I'm sort of thinking is perhaps overdetermined if the Pavlovian Marxian, Stanislavskian determinist environmental design of Khrzhanovskiy and Szybanov indeed functions as it is intended to function by the impression I formed during my visits to 100 Piccadilly in summer 2019. Here's Khrzhanovskiy and Szybanov on the set being suitably demiurgic. So I've organized my impressions and notes. I've disorganized into the following preliminary and overlapping typology, which I won't go into detail about every aspect of this typology here. Today you'll be relieved to hear, but I will refer to a few of these categories. And number 3, the terrain of toxic masculinity. Number 5, underpant determinism. Number 6, communist plenty. Number 7, logical conclusionism. And number 10, capitalist realism or reflection theory. So to start with the visit to 100 Piccadilly, this visit was very underwhelming. That's the word I remember writing down at the time, and I see that Eugénie used the same word actually in her description of the Paris exhibition in Kino Kultura. The underwhelmingness was compounded, I think, by the fact that the interior of 100 Piccadilly had clearly been in place already for a decade or so and had not been refreshed. In fact, everything looked more or less as it did in the footage from the Paris event, but worse. The carpet exuded a sort of dank odor. The poor quality wax figurines were faded and dirty. The frameless Soviet poster reproductions were dog-eared and weathered. And in keeping with with category 3 of my typology, I also noticed a tattered old hanging poster of the female internal sexual organs, which wasn't even Soviet, and for that reason, somehow all the more strikingly gratuitous and sort of inexplicable. There were also taxidermy fragments of animals, mostly pigs. And after I watched Getting the Pig getting killed by Marcinkiewicz, by Tesak and his neo-Nazi companions at the end of Nowy Człowiek, or was it Degeneracja, or both? I can't even, I think it was Nowy Człowiek as well as Degeneracja. I was treated to a meal at the in-house Stolowaja. I think it consisted of pelmeni, mousse, and vodka. As I ate my pork dumplings, I stared at the disembodied roaring boar's head in the middle of the table, and I think that perhaps it was supposed to provoke some sort of unpleasant Pavlovian reaction. So a few more points about the DAU films relating to the categories laid out above. Throughout the DAU movies that I've seen, I've seen four of them, or bits of 4 of them, there is a cornucopia of food and booze, not just vodka and sausage, but also grapes and brandy and champagne at all levels of the hierarchy, from Landau's apartment to the buffet. So why is there so much plenty in DAU? Why is there so much food and booze readily available all the time? Streams and streams of it. The food flows as readily and as easily as the blood and the semen. And this reminds me of a sort of recurring, perhaps quasi-ironic theme in contemporary, which one could identify in contemporary sort of 2010s Russian culture, which is about the reconstruction of the USSR, but better and cleaner and more successful than it was before. So this is the theme, arguably, behind the ongoing Blagoustroystvo, or reconstruction of VDNH, the Stalin-era exhibition ground in North Moscow, which is currently being restored to a kind of gentrified fantasy of Stalinist perfection. It's also perhaps the theme that's kind of perhaps slightly presciently satirized in the mass market 2006 the Guzman dark comedy Park of the Soviet period, which is regularly invoked in name, if not in substance, in discussions, in Russian discussions about DAU, especially. And it brings to mind also, for me at least, elements in the recently opened Kremlin-adjacent Zaryadye Park, which is one of the main subjects of my current research. This theme is most vividly embodied in the park's main restaurant, Vashod, initially to be called Sayuz, whose proprietor, celebrity restaurateur Alexander Rapaport, and designers Irina and Olga Sundukova, sort of well-known luxury interior designers in Moscow at the moment, described its design ideology as being about creating a space which, quote, feels like the Soviet Union but without shortages, end quote. Sovietski Soyuz na bez deficitów, and that's a quote from my interview with the 2 Sundukov sisters. The above also calls to mind a kind of twisted version of socialist realism, which can be called capitalist realism, in a sort of merger of the concepts proposed by the philosopher Mark Fisher, and some years before Fisher, in 2006, by the architectural critics Bart Goldhorn and Philip Moyser in their book about post-Soviet architecture, which also pertains to the next category, logical conclusionism. DAU has been sort of ridiculed for the absurd way, but rightly, I think, in which it attempts to create a conceit of authenticity by making extras and visitors wear Soviet underwear and eat Soviet food and spend replica Soviet money and so on. And it's curious then that when it comes to the set design, interior too, but exterior especially, this concern with authenticity seems to dissipate or at least mutates into something else. The kind of grandiose set of DAU created by Denis Shribanov, this is him, but I'm not sure if it's a wax model of him or if it's actually him. I just found this on Google. Created by him in the defunct open-air swimming pool of Dynamo Kharkiv, as well as in various other locations throughout the city and beyond, that adds up to this kind of absurd parody of Stalinist architecture, which feels a bit like a Terry Gilliam movie, or in its more thoughtful but no less derivative moments, like the Soviet-inspired monumental postmodern edifices of the sort built by Catalan architect Ricardo Bofill in the 80s and in the 90s. But it certainly doesn't look like anything like the Soviet Union, nor does it look like it's trying to be realistic in any way. And the set design has been described in various ways. There's a text on the BBC Russian service which describes it as exaggerated constructivism. Shibanov himself, however, sees it rather as something akin to undead Stalinism or zombie Stalinism. Stalinism taken to its logical conclusion, as he told Kommersant journalist Ilya Kashin, quote, "After the death of Stalin, there was a campaign against excesses in architecture. But here I wanted instead to bring superfluity to its absolute fucking limits." And in fact, actually, he said "Даже до пиздеца." That was that was the words he chose to describe the kind of how the set should look. And in fact, a further unrealized film Gorod na Vysotie was to be set in a Moscow in which the palace of the Soviets had actually been built and was supposed to be built somehow to scale, I think, on the roof of the Gazprom in Kharkov. As Shibanov told Komsomolskaya Pravda, "I thought it would be really glorious if we imagined that Stalin never died in '53 and his favorite style in architecture had reached its apogee." Which brings us back again to the question of the sort of relationship to sexuality and gender that DAU exudes. The violence of DAU's masculine sort of toxic masculinity, what one could call toxic masculinity, is clearly discernible, explicitly discernible in its design ideology. The entire institute, presumably in some sort of crass reference to Landau's interest in polyamory, is built apparently as an embodiment of the female sexual organs. On one side of the institute, the one with the long vertical openings on the left was named by Shibanov himself, this is what he told Kashin, as vagina, whereas the opposite side with the round porthole-like openings was known as nipple. And Shibanov told Kashin how he looked endlessly for design inspiration until suddenly, quote, "In the course of one night, all of this was born in my head. First one wall, then the other wall. They formed a whole, and all the remaining buildings and structures clicked into place." Kashin adds in the text of his Kommersant text, this is from 2011, this article, "Denis asked that I remove from the text his recollection of the 2 nights of uninterrupted sex which preceded this epiphany. But without this recollection, it would be impossible for the reader to understand why the rules of the Institute have these physiological names." And I think it's fair to say that a kind of repeated tendency for these kind of male demiurges to name bits of architecture after parts of the sexual anatomy is definitely a thing in DAU. The substance of Shibanov's statement to Kashin is seconded by the above-mentioned anatomical chart hanging in the Stolovaya at 100 Piccadilly, and further by the naming conventions of the bar, the Stolovaya, in the Paris DAU exhibition. In the words of what appeared to be a male French DAO staffer, as rendered again on the BBC Russian service website, "There is a secret room here, it's called the vagina, and there is like a really cool floor, a really soft floor, and you can visit it." But as the subtitles to the BBC film suggest, however, another name for the vagina bar, perhaps the official name, is Sranaya Dira, so literally the shithole. And quite what this double naming convention is supposed to indicate is left unexplored. Probably it's supposed to be some sort of clever, ironic joke, but the consequences are rather disturbing, all the more so when one calls to mind the social, psychological impulse, this kind of conditioning impulse at the heart of DAO. And given the numerous rumors of sexual violence plaguing the deterministic planet of DAO, all the above monikers, and the closed planet of DAO, all the above monikers and declarations seem particularly troubling. And I just concluding, because I'm probably running out of time, to sort of expand slightly on this notion of determinism or conditioning. Sophie Pinkham in her recent text on DAO commented on what she calls the reductive Pavlovianism of DAO. The filmmaker's expectation that the, quote, unmediated experience of authentic Soviet commodities and brutalized personal relationships will trigger examinable reactions. And Khrzhanovskiy's repeated quite sort of banal references to the Stanford prison experiment and to his desire to use the film to extract what he repeatedly calls the genotype, the genotype of the Soviet person, do, I think, bolster Sophie's characterization, as do various other statements by Shabanov, which I don't have time to quote now. Pinkham also points out that the chief financier of the project is the oligarch Sergei, well, sort of mini-garch, Sergei Adonyev, probably now no longer an oligarch, Sergei Adonyev, co-founder with the Dutch star architect Bram Koolhaas of the kind of innovative architecture and design bureau Strelka Institute. Strelka has, since its foundation in 2009, spawned a vast consulting bureau carrying out state-financed projects of blagoustroystva, urban improvement or fortifications in cities all over Russia and the former USSR. And blagoustroystva also has this kind of deeply deterministic ideology at its core. I'll just play, I don't know, can you hear the sound? Yes.
Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. Karl Marx famously claimed that it's the being that determines consciousness rather than vice versa, a maxim that some Russian city planners have recently taken to heart with a much greater eagerness than their Soviet predecessors. As the wave of urban makeovers moves across the country, will the change in the way the Russians live affect how they think?
So this determinism manifests itself in sort of myriad interesting ways. And one aspect of the rhetoric of blagoustroystva that I find particularly interesting for my own research, but also in this context, is the use of what I call these vernacular Marxist ideas about the relationship between human consciousness and material conditions. And in particular, I have in mind this phrase, being determined consciousness, bytio определяет сознание, which is a quote from Karl Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy. And it's routinely deployed quite often in kind of everyday discussions about blagoustroystva. To the extent that even when I posted this RT video, one of my Facebook friends commented, "Yeah, we Slavs love this quotation." So, I mean, I'll just kind of, without going on anymore, I'll leave this hanging, but I just sort of will ask to end the presentation, what is the significance of the fact that DAU and the world beyond, not necessarily just the world of contemporary Russia, but I think our current kind of architectural moment certainly is so peppered with these kind of coded determinisms, whether of the kind of Stanislavskian, Pavlovian, or Marxist variety. So that's it. Then apologize if I've gone over time.
Thanks, Michał. Not at all. That was great. Okay, so our last speaker is Phil Cavendish. I think Phil is going to talk about the reception of DAU. Is that right, Phil?
Yes, that is indeed what I'm going to be talking about. Good evening, everybody. I'm, as I said, going to be talking about the critical reception of DAU, but before I begin, I'd just like to thank Julian Graffi for compiling his bibliography of critical materials and making it available to members of the Russian Cinema Research Group, because without this bibliography, my task this evening would have been infinitely more time-consuming than it has been. It would be difficult to speak of a critical consensus emerging in relation to DAU. In fact, it would be more accurate to refer to a critical split or chasm. The films have undoubtedly proved enormously controversial. The disturbing and for some shocking nature of the materials released so far has provoked condemnation in many quarters, in particular in Ukraine. The scenes of sexual intimacy, because of their explicit nature and the impression that they're genuine rather than simulated, have given rise to accusations of pornographic intent. The provocative nature of other sequences, for example, the interrogation episode in DAU Natasha, which witnesses Natalia Berezhnaya, the main protagonist, compelled to abuse herself with an empty bottle of cognac, have given rise to concerns about the conditions prevailing at the Institute and the allegedly tyrannical and abusive working methods adopted by Khrzhanovskiy and his entourage as part of the filmmaking process. In the view of some observers, participants like Berezhnaya have clearly been traumatized by their experience and should be considered victims of the cinematic equivalent of Stockholm Syndrome. These same commentators have argued that the intrusion of contemporary speech and non-normative language, as well as the modes of behavior, attitudes and approaches to lovemaking, significantly compromise the conceptual rationale of the construction of the Institute in the first place and render the project a failed endeavor, if not a folie de grandeur. Even those well disposed towards the project in principle have expressed disappointment in relation to the actual cinematic outcomes. The prose writer Vladimir Sorokin, for example, who wrote the scenario for the project in its original incarnation as a biographical film about Landau, but later distanced himself as the project assumed ever more grandiose proportions and changed conceptually, it must be said, maintains that the screened materials merely show, and I quote, post-Sovs playing at being Sovs, and for this reason are unsuccessful. Sophie Pinkham, a New York-based commentator specializing in Russian and Ukrainian culture, history, and politics, has argued, and I quote, that the improvised conversations in the films as she describes them are often numbingly banal and rife with anachronisms. For Brigitte Salino and Aureliano Tonnet, writing in Le Monde in response to the Paris exhibitions and cited by Birgit in her response to the screenings in Kino Kultura, the community in the reconstructed Institute for Physical Problems is a crypto community, and Khrzhanovskiy's experiment is, quote, unmeasured, violent, and confused, close quotes. Pitted against negative responses like these is the robust defense of DAU on the part of critics and cultural commentators grouped around film journals like Искусство Kino and Séance, as well as various reputable cultural websites. Anton Dolin, for example, the editor of Искусство Kino, has argued, and I quote again, that DAU is the most extraordinary alliance of the authentic and the invented in the history of cinema, and that DAU fundamentally reconceptualizes the role of the actor in cinema. DAU has been defined in terms of post-cinema and post-doc conceptual art experience as a sophisticated variation and or subversion of the conventions of reality TV, as a socio-psychological experiment analogous to the infamous Stanford prison experiment conducted by Philip Lombardo in 1971, and as the culmination of various experiments in avant-garde cinema and theatre, some of them dating back to the 1920s. The multiplicity of potential presentational platforms and formats, the engagement of different editors, the uncertain ordering of the titles from a diegetic chronological perspective, and the possibility that the filmed material could potentially be arranged into different narrative permutations have been welcomed as artistically productive and given rise to the idea that any critical evaluation of DAU at the present moment in time is bound to be contingent, provisional, and subject to re-evaluation as more materials are released. Such responses accept without reservation the shocking and provocative nature of the project. One critic, Sergei Dyoshin, has invoked the precedent of Antonin Artaud's theatre of cruelty. He describes DAU as, quote, modernism with a knife in its hand. Others, such as Michał Jampolsky, Yuri Gershowitz, and the late Robert Bird, have traced the conceptual origins of DAU to the theatrical experiments of Eugénie Barba from the 1960s onwards, and the processual experiments of Russian theatre directors Boris Yukhananov and Anatoly Vasilyev since the 1990s. For those not familiar with his name, Barba is an Italian-born writer and director who studied under the Polish avant-garde theatre director Jerzy Grotowski in the 1960s and founded the Odin Theatre in Denmark. And Vasilyev, as Birgit has already said, plays the role of the Institute's director, Grupica, and edited the film entitled DAU, Explosion. In terms of cinematic precedent, one critic, Vasily Koretsky, has described DAU in terms of Pasoline's Sala, or 120 Days of Sodom, dating from 1975, but, as he explains, with real shit and real sodomy. Some of the films have been classified as intimate chamber pieces, which evoke the works of Bernardo Bertolucci, such as Last Tango in Paris, Ingmar Bergman, for example, his films Scenes from a Marriage and Autumn Sonata, and the early avant-garde films of Rainer Werner Fassbinder. The intrusion of the 21st century, rather than a conceptual failure which punctures the myth of total immersion, is interpreted from this perspective as evidence of Khrzhanovskiy's creative adaptability and desire to explore the complex web of psychological and emotional ties that bind the Russian present and the Soviet past. For film critic Alexander Timofeyevsky, for example, in conversation with the Russian writer Tatiana Tolstoya, 21st century is actually the fully fledged hero of the film. His position, as she's already articulated this evening, is shared by Eugénie Zvonkine, who argued in her initial response to the Paris exhibitions that the purpose of DAU is, I quote, to mix the contemporary era with an idea of the past in an experience of shared time and collective isolation from the normal world, that is supposed to test our moral values and boundaries. Eugénie, so far, is alone among academics and critical commentators in seeking to trace the individual narratives of the film to the original literary source on which the project in its initial formulation was ostensibly based, namely the memoirs of Cora Landau. This process of tracing narrative plot lines to real life events in these memoirs is an important and intriguing one, but it does nevertheless expose the degree of contrivance that's been involved in generating the subjects or themes of the individual films. This issue defines the degree to which DAU should be regarded as a fundamentally fictional enterprise with little or no relationship to the reality prevailing in the reconstructed institute, or as an exercise in quasi-scientific and quasi-anthropological observation. There may be disagreement about the artistic quality of the outcomes, but the ambiguity and complexity of the filmmaking procedure itself is undeniable. Film historians will of course argue that it's not the first time that actors, whether professionally trained or otherwise, have been encouraged or compelled to inhabit specific environments for the purposes of immersing themselves in the lived experience of the characters they're supposed to be playing in the interests of authenticity. They could also point out that neither is DAU the first occasion on which a film director has experimented with non-professional actors or invited musical or artistic celebrities to participate in fictional cinematic enterprises, or for that matter, borrowed the identities, everyday behavior and mannerisms of their acting ensemble for the purposes of constructing fictional narratives. For example, John Cassavetes and Michelangelo Antonioni would be notable cases in point. Nevertheless, bearing in mind the illusion of reality that DAU seeks to contrive and the very particular set of pressures to which the acting ensemble was supposedly subjected, it's inevitable that Khrzhanovsky's acting methodology should have attracted critical attention. Interviews given by some of the participants have cast important light on this process. They suggest that contrary to the carefully engineered myth, one which is manifested in the creation of pseudo-biographies using the participants' real names on the DAU website, and Dmitry Kaledin's fictional history of the Institute in Искусство Kino, Khrzhanovsky's actors and invited foreign guests were not completely isolated from the world outside during their time at the Institute. In relation to the filming process, the director of photography, Jürgen Jürges, has stated that there were no formal scripts, no lines to memorize, no rehearsals, and no repeated takes. At the same time, it's quite clear from the interviews with participants that the more controversial scenes were proposed and discussed in advance. According to Beumers, this was true of the infamous interrogation sequence in DAU Natasha, to which she admits having given her consent. The same applies to the scenes of sexual intimacy between Ekaterina Yuspina, who plays herself, Katya, and Tatiana Palozhi, Tanya, in the film entitled DAU, Katya, Tanya. This development was apparently suggested by the co-director, Ekaterina Ertel, although Yuspina argues that the sexual relationship was something that could potentially have occurred spontaneously outside the framework of the Institute. Taken together, these interviews suggest that while general frameworks and specific responses were agreed in advance, there was significant room for improvisation. Two particular moments stand out. The first is Birgit's decision at the end of her ordeal to kiss her interrogator, Vladimir Azhipo, the KGB officer and in real life former prison interrogator. Apparently this was on her own initiative. The second is the interrogation sequence involving the real life physicist Andrei Losiev, which witnesses him accused of concealing his Jewish ethnicity and threatened with physical violence to the point where, with his face turned to the wall, his body begins to shudder and we hear him crying. It should be pointed out that the revelations offered by participants are not always consistent. Luc Biget, for example, ostensibly a foreign visitor to the Institute, but in real life a trained biochemist and founder of the so-called University of the Symbol, has given a different account of his relationship with Birgit and accused Khrzhanovsky of subterfuge in filming some of the sex scenes without consent. On the basis of the vast majority of the material released so far, however, it would appear, as Birgit has already indicated tonight, that the vast majority of the scenes of sexual intimacy were filmed with the participants perfectly aware of the camera's presence. For some, these scenes are powerful precisely because they are authentic. Dorlin has argued, for example, that DAU shows sex as you've never seen it before on screen. I'm quoting him, although his comment suggests that he's possibly not seen Michael Winterbottom's 2004 film 9 Songs. For other commentators, however, the acting methodology gives rise to several weaknesses, one of which, according to Pinkham, is the negative impact of the viewer inevitably being distracted by the quest to identify the real versus the fabricated. Some of the films are clearly more artificial and contrived than others. DAU, New Man, for example, witnesses the total destruction of the Institute by rampaging neo-Nazis, led by Maxim Marcinkiewicz, a genuine neo-Nazi with a track record of genuine violence and prison sentences to his name. But the gruesome murders of the scientists and staff are, of course, simulated. Another problem is the lack of self-reflection on the part of the participants, although this does distinguish DAU from precursors in the sphere of reality TV and precludes its potential designation as neo-Stalinist rival to Love Island. Like reality TV shows, however, some participants are more interesting than others, even if their personal charisma and intrinsic interest of protagonists can occasionally feel obscured, if not totally obliterated, by the drunken, repetitive, labored, and at times circular conversations. Zoya Popova, for example, one of the several sexual partners of Nikita Nekrasov in DAO String Theory, at one point refuses to discuss their relationship any further on the grounds that everything is, in her own words, painful, endless, and senseless. At times, one feels the same in relation to the DAO project as a whole, although it would be difficult to deny that the innovative filmmaking method, the performances, and the extraordinary set design, even at times guilty of anachronism and historical lapses, make for a compelling and haunting viewing experience. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So we have actually already got to 7:30, but hopefully, well, we can carry on as long as everybody else is okay to carry on. If not, feel free to leave, but I'm sure people have questions, and I've already got some in the chat, which I'm going to read in a moment. Just before we move on to questions, I just want to flag up that we have actually, in good DAOian fashion, if that's the right adjective, we are releasing our information about DAO in various installments, and we have another seminar coming up on January the 25th, which is going to be given by Alexandre, I'm not sure how to pronounce his surname, Zayezyev. I'm sorry, correct me please if that's wrong, who's a PhD candidate. Is this Alexandre? Hi. So Alexandra is a PhD candidate at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and he's going to give us a paper. We don't know exactly the topic. We wanted to wait to see what was covered in today's event, and Alexandre is going to adapt to fit around that. So watch this space, and if you want to find out more information about that event, you're very welcome to join our mailing list. I'm going to put that in the chat so that you can email me. Okay, so our first question is from Nancy Condi, who is in the audience. So I'll read this out for her. She says, we are increasingly asked to consider questions of political correctness, some empathic, some cloyingly pedagogical. Would the participants, A, be comfortable assigning some excerpt of DAO to be screened in a postgraduate course, or B, are the very transgressions of the film such that it's best to turn one's scholarly attentions elsewhere? Its circulation is surely no longer, quote, an innocent act. Should we care? Happy to hear a range of views, so no censure from Nancy. And actually that's a question that I've been considering over the last few days when I've been watching the films, although I was thinking also about a final year undergraduate course. So which of the panelists wants to take that question first? Phil? You're muted.
I'm very happy to try and answer that question. I think there are some films that could be shown to a postgraduate audience, but I think there are quite a few that couldn't. I think some of the chamber pieces, String Theory, for example, if I'm remembering this correctly, ends up with a number of women confronting Nekrasov about his approach to free love and pointing out his complete hypocrisy and emptiness. And while Nekrasov starts as a relatively charismatic and interesting character, I think by the end, you realize as part of this confrontation, if you hadn't realized it before, and I think probably the vast majority of you had realized it, that his justification, his intellectual justification for his marital dignity is self-serving. But there are many, many very disturbing scenes in this film. In the films, are they more disturbing than similar sorts of sequences in other films which postgraduates might have access to? I'm not sure whether they are more disturbing. And I suppose the question would then be about trigger warnings, about giving people the options not to watch the films if they didn't wish to, and providing them with alternatives. But I think the films, several of the films, as Natasha has indicated, raise some very, very difficult questions about the participation, about the whole process, the decisions made as part of the casting process, which seems to me one of the main areas where Khrzhanovskiy exerted control over who essentially was admitted to the Institute and why, and the ways in which the personal biographies and personalities gave rise to their inclusion in the project. In other words, there's a sense in which people were excluded and people were included on the basis of what Khrzhanovskiy thought they would bring to this project. And I would certainly welcome a great deal more information about how that process occurred, and more information indeed about the whole preparation process for the filming itself. Thank you.
Does anyone else have an opinion? Nancy says short answers are also good, which I guess means yes or no. And we do have students in the audience as well. So if any of you have any opinions about that, let us know or type them in the chat. Anyone else want?
Maybe
Eugénie?
I cannot really answer this question because I think the French context is very, very different from the American one, on this idea that students could not be able to deal with stuff. But of course, as Phil, I would say that you can choose films that are less shocking. Of course, we know already the titles of the film that concentrated most of the scandal. So Phil talked about string theory. There is also 3 days. I think there is nothing shocking in 3 days. And also DAU is confronted by both women in the end and kind of looks a little bit stupid for his for his ways. So I think you can choose, but the question is what to talk about. So if it's just to pick one film and to take it out of context, it becomes just a classical fiction film. And if it is to talk about the project and all of its complexities, maybe it could be interesting to show also a little bit more challenging films, but introducing them, or as Phil said, just authorizing students that would be uncomfortable not to watch them if they don't want to. I don't know.
Okay, Andrew, George, I don't think you can put your hand. Oh yeah, no, you can't put your hand up on Zoom, can you? That's Teams. Andrew, if you have a question, you're welcome to ask it. If you want to.
Yeah, I'll try to make it really short. I think Philip already said some of it. When I watched the 5 films I saw, I was reminded of Bergman and Fassbinder, these kind of sadomasochistic chamber pieces like Petra von Kant and Merchant Four Seasons, Cries and Whispers. And to me, the most shocking thing about the 5 films I've seen, so I've not seen all 700 hours, was how unshocking they were given the hype and the hyperbole. Obviously things like sexual violence and so on. I think in 2020 we should be warning students in a world where this is, you know, an epidemic and it's still a patriarchal world, that these films contain these things. But for me, what struck me about all of the films was the dialogue and the actors' faces. So I was expecting to see something very grand and avant-garde, and I just saw something that was kind of like Fassbinder, but when you go to Moscow and you stay in a nice hotel or in Airbnb rather than in one of the smaller hostels. So That's my contribution, really. I suppose I've not seen the other stuff, but if you don't know that that guy's a Nazi in Nowy Człowiek, then, you know, the most shocking thing about it to me is how inadequate he seems sexually. Like, it's not very either romantic or very pneumatic. So that was the most shocking thing for me.
Does anyone want to come back to that, or Okay, so we have a question from Marina. Marina, do you want to ask the question yourself, or shall I read it?
I'm happy to ask it. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Marina Pezenti. I actually used to collaborate with Phil Cavendish on a presentation of some Ukrainian avant-garde film in London a couple of years ago, and was involved in promoting some Ukrainian cultural diplomacy projects in London. Actually, in Ukraine, Ilya Khrzhanovskiy is a hotly contested figure which ignites lots of passion. And as you probably know, he's an artistic director in a major Holocaust commemoration project, Babyn Yar, which does ignite a lot of passions on the sides of Ukrainian artists and intellectuals. And my question is the following: do you see, you know, the oeuvre of Khrzhanovskiy as some kind of a reflection of the system, of the narratives and of the methods of the country from which he originates? From what I mean by that, you know, the amount of material that he produces could be compared to, you know, the volume which is churned out by Russian television and, you know, various media outlets, and the narratives that he constructs, which is, you know, on the surface, it seems to be like a condemnation of the Soviet totalitarianism and the system, you know, of the system that it deployed. But in reality, it's nothing more than pretty much like a circus. We can't really take it, you know, as in an ethical dimension, as a condemnation of the, you know, violation of human rights, etc., of the Soviet period. So, you know, one could easily imagine sort of like a DAU-inspired restaurant in Moscow. You know, it kind of glamorizes that system because so much has been spent on reproducing in minute detail, you know, the detail of interiors, the costumes, etc. But in essence, it doesn't really deliver any condemnation, you know, of the system which it aspires to represent. I really would like to hear your opinion on that.
Thank you, Marina. Who wants to respond to Marina first?
I would like
Natascha?
to. Yeah, I completely agree. I would also say that DAU is something like a project. I think the films, they come too late. They should have been happening like 10 years ago, and they would have been maybe still okay, but it's just now it's too late. It's kind of still this, it might be still bearable from the perspective of performance art, if you kind of are interested in that. But this is actually not the topic of our this is not our research area. We are film studies people, and I think as films they do not deliver. And if Nancy asked, should one teach them, I would definitely not teach them, because it involves that you have to pay for them, and I wouldn't pay for even that little amount for this kind of, to see, like, and then everybody would pay. So it's a weird situation you get in, although it's only so small. So the amount is small, and I find it interesting because for me this is part of this what Phil said, the Stockholm syndrome, which is then also we are also victims or part of this. Kind of we become members of this closed society, this institute, and as viewers we are just part of it, and it's just I think one should not. I'm very much against it. I'm sorry, and I think if one wants to present it, you have to package it, as Birgit says, you have to kind of do what they did in Paris. I think this is a good idea. But then when they presented it in Berlin, for example, there was no packaging. There was just a normal event, and everybody was dressed up as if they were going to the Oscars. So this whole festival circuit does not really fit DAU, and one shouldn't try to introduce DAU into that circuit. It just doesn't work, I think. This is my opinion, and it's a quite strong opinion. We will see perhaps in 10 years, maybe it will be different, really, and I have to revise it. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. Does anyone want to? Phil? You're muted.
I keep pressing the wrong button. It's actually difficult, I think, to offer a really sort of coherent response to your question, because it opens up so many different angles of vision. But there is, if we pursue the idea that these films are essentially contrivances, then the question that has to be asked is whether the construction of the Institute was necessary in order to produce the kinds of responses you see. And I seriously question whether it's possible, simply on the basis of an architectural design, to recreate the either Stalinist or Soviet mental landscape, the imaginative world, the interior world of people who went through that system. I think it's virtually impossible. And therefore, the question in my mind is, what exactly is the pressure that is felt by living in an institution? I simply don't believe that wearing historical underwear or eating food, or perhaps even watching Stalin-era films, which maybe some of the participants were subjected to, can really recreate the conditions of that period. So therefore, what is the actual purpose of it? And wouldn't it be better to continue to make films about this period or about the Soviet experience in the way that previous directors have done, very powerfully, very movingly, very profoundly, very subtly? Alexei German is a wonderful example. I was struck when looking at the actual Institute of Physical Problems, in other words, the historical institute, how different it is from the institute that Khrzhanovskiy commissioned and had constructed. It's different architecturally. It overlooks parkland. The whole lighting conditions within the building are completely different. You know, one would like to spend a great deal of time talking about the lighting and the non-period specific light bulbs that are being used in order to record on the cameras that are being used. But again, for me, the whole conceptual rationale, if it is indeed to recreate something of the conditions of this period, is false. What we're dealing with is something entirely different. The question is, what is it that we're dealing with? What is the artistic force of what we're dealing with? Are we convinced and persuaded by it? Is it telling us anything profound? Just finally, to finish, I think there is always a role and a place for films that explore the sorts of things that DAU explores. And I would have thought that recent events in Russia over the last, let's say, 8 years would make the exploration of these subjects even more relevant than it's ever been before. Thank you. Thanks,
Phil. You've also raised questions that are sort of bothering me about this project too. I've only seen 4 films. And I'm struck by both Birgit and Eugénie agreeing that the point is not the evocation of the past, but looking at people in the present in these sort of circumstances. And yet that contrasts for me with what I see almost as this extreme fetishization of the Soviet period. The camera lingers, you know, really intrusively on the Soviet rubles, for example. It's almost like he's saying, look, these are proper Soviet notes, look. The camera does the same with the underwear, and obviously there's another dynamic going on as well. But it's interesting, it's problematic. Anyway, I'm hijacking the questions, I'm abusing chair's privilege. We have a question from Alexandra. His microphone's not working, so I'm going to read it out. So he says, in his article, Excess, Hysteria, Destruction, which gave the title to our event, Michał Jampolski writes, and this is a quotation, "Due to time and material limitations, no other experiment in mastering the artistic method has been so consistent and up to its own exhaustion, except of course for the practice of Soviet art." So his question is, would you, the participants, agree with this claim? Do you think that Khrzhanovsky's artistic method is consistent? Who'd like to take that first? Eugénie?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Alexander. I quite like this paper by Jampolski. So where, if I remember correctly, he also mentions the Eisenstein reference in regard to degeneration. I would say that I don't think it's 100% consistent, but as I think almost no method is really 100% consistent on the set. There is what the directors say, and then there's what they do. And usually there is always kind of room between these two things. But I would rather say that it is a kind of a methodological experiment of how one could work with actors. And I just wanted to comment on this underwear thing where we're saying all of us, but you know that's exactly what German did. German, he was absolutely adamant that the people who are in the tramway, which is in the back of the frame, should be wearing Soviet underwear in the bus. I mean, and of course, everything else also Soviet, but so no way of this being visible on screen, but still he almost like a fetish believed that it would create something. So I don't know if it's true or not, if he's, I mean, it's not quantifiable in a scientific manner, but clearly this is a belief also that Khrzhanovsky kind of inherits from people like German. Exactly. I think German would have quite loved the idea of the institute in itself. And also I would say that in both cases it's very different results, very different outcomes, but in both, if we take Hrustalov and if we take DAU, in both cases it's underpants Soviet, but the result is not realistic at all. Just it's very different forms. So, and I will stop there. And I see Birgit is right.
Birgit, do you want to come in? Do you want to come in? Yeah.
Yes, I am coming in, but I have been muted twice, so it's my own doing. I'd like to add two things. One in connection with what Phil has been talking about and what you have just been talking about, precisely about the authenticity and also fake. Yes, of course, you know, you are on a stage, you know that, let me just move into a theater. You're on a stage, you know that everything is fake, you know that it is a stage, you know that everything is built, but you always have a few points of reference as a well-trained actor that are genuine. Let me give you an example from a production by Anatoly Vasilyev, who is not that very far away from Khrzhanovsky and who has studied both with Grotowski and with other directors you have mentioned in your own presentation, Phil. So, and there are two things that I think we are not connecting here. The first is that in order to go into a role, you annihilate yourself, so you forget everything. And that purpose is served by moving actors into a special space. But what we're all forgetting here is that they are moved in there for a period of 3 years. This is not a day, this is not a week, this is not a month, this is years, right? And there comes a point when you forget that outside life. So the second thing is that one of the essential ways of identifying is that you have an authentic item. You don't want to call it a prop because it's authentic. So in order to play a role, to sexual attraction to someone, an actress may not wear underwear. In order to recreate a historical dimension to a role, an actress may play in a dress that was originally worn by Maria Babanova, right? You will act differently, you will perform differently. This is a dress that has history to it. So that's about this whole business about authenticity and fake. Yes, it is both. And I don't see the contradiction in it. And the second thing is that when you talk about acting, in your response just now, you talked about improvisation, and you talked at the same time about actors and actresses being forced to do things. That's a contradiction. It's a contradiction in itself. But at the same time, it is the basic method for the acting tradition of Barba, of Grotowski, of Vasiliev. It is that you are entirely free to improvise, and you are entirely restricted within certain points in the structure of a text. It's a kind of very basic method, very difficult to carry out, but very easy to understand from the abstract. And that is precisely what Khrzhanovskiy is doing here. That's why you have rehearsals, and at the same time, you have absolute freedom to improvise within the knots of that structure, within the points of that structure that are fixed, and those points you can't move. So I think there are ways in which we can look at the play with authenticity and fake, but we need to factor in acting practices, and we also need to factor in time. And I think time is an essential bit here, and one that we may want to focus on a little more, because as we have all mentioned, this covers over 25 years of Soviet history, and yet we are moving in the same set. Right, so you are not going to tell me that nothing has changed over 25 years of Soviet history between 1953, 1955 to 1968. So what is happening here is a moment of frozen time that does not allow any development, but at the same time it does allow development. So I think we need to approach this with an underlying element of finding contradictions. But these contradictions are there for a reason. They are there to challenge us who are viewing this, who are experiencing this. They are intended to destabilize us. Yes, very uncomfortable, but I'm afraid that is the kind of art that I'm looking for. That is the kind of art that makes me think, and that makes things shift, if ever.
Phil.
Yes, I mean, I agree with everything that you say, apart from one or two things. I perhaps didn't express myself quite as clearly as I should have done. There are things that occur in certain sequences which would appear to be spontaneous responses, invented responses, if you like, on the part of the participants. Things that had not been planned. Mm-hmm. Obviously, one needs to know a little bit more about what exactly was proposed and what exactly was discussed. I think the question more really is about the frameworks within which the participants were placed in terms of suggested subjects, suggested themes, suggested relationships, the degree to which those occurred spontaneously within the Institute and were then, as it were, put into play as something that was potentially filmable. I mean, I ask this question because I don't know the answer, but it would appear that some of the things that were filmed were the result of a quite complex process that wasn't just about authenticity, it wasn't just about spontaneity. So I think you're right to say that the film charts a line between what is contrived or planned or expected, and what is actually what had actually occurred in the Institute itself. I have to say, though, that firstly, it would appear on the basis of the interviews that have been published so far that the Institute was not hermetically sealed for some of the participants. The two participants who play in Khrzhanovskiy, for example, one of them commuted to the Institute on a daily basis. The other one regularly interrupted her work to fulfill modeling contracts. And therefore, it would be difficult to talk about them having been immersed in the same way that other people may have been immersed for a longer period of time. So I think their working period was actually only several months within the Institute. I think the final thing I wanted to say was when we judge the overall impact, and you're right to say that the experience is an extremely destabilizing one. The question in my mind was, there are other films that have adopted different methodologies into the different acting methodologies, which are equally as disturbing, if not more so, and more profoundly so. They're no less disturbing for the fact that they're acted. And I think that's the question that we need to focus on. And there are theatrical experiences which are equally as profound and equally as disturbing, if not more so, but are the product of work, very often years' work with an acting ensemble, as you know yourself. So this isn't, I wasn't expressing a judgment or a view. I was expressing the questions or articulating the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves in relation to A, the outcome, and B, the process. At the moment, we only see the outcome, and we've only had a very small glimpse of the process.
Okay, we do actually have 3 more questions in a queue. Are we okay to take those? It's 8 o'clock. Say if you've had enough. Yeah, maybe we should take all 3 and then you can answer whichever one you want. So Masha, do you want to go first with your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rachel. And it's so good to be here. And I hope you forgive me this little kind of fetishization of style. I made it particularly for DAU discussion, but I have a question for Michał, because I was fascinated with your, well, looking through your topology with your final point on burger and lobster. And my question is, like, I wonder what you meant by that. But to that question, I also have a little anecdote, and I hope, like, I'll try to be as brief as I can, but it's directly connected to my experience of watching DAU project in Paris 2 years ago, in a kind of full, well, as full as it could get, where I went to watch it with my husband, who has nothing to do with film study, who actually worked for Burger Lobster at that time. And what he was fascinated to see, because for me it was all, like, again, very much in line to what has been discussed here, to see it through a film scholar's kind of lens. But for him, it was seeing his childhood friends, because apparently, you know, the kind of owner of Burger Lobster is the best friend with Khrzhanovskiy, and they kind of invited all their friends to be actors on the set. And at that point I realized, and this, you know, that made me think, when Philip and Eugénie were mentioning this kind of tracing of personal narrative, to which extent is actually the tracing of personal narrative of Ilya Khrzhanovskiy himself, and not just his kind of narratives, but his generational. And I kind of thinking here about, like, this recent book by Elizabeth Schimpf-Fossel, Rich Russians, from oligarch to bourgeoisie, where she's saying that, you know, these new Russian kind of oligarchs need some kind of justification for them to become a new class. And, you know, we all know these connections of Ilya to this kind of one particular oligarch in making of this project. And, you know, all this connection to me kind of made it clear that there is some kind of generational kind of urge of, you know, self-realization through that romantic, some kind of, you know, fascination and fetishization of Soviet experience. So again, this is just a comment and a question, you know, a direct question to Michał about, you know, Burger Lobster and what he meant by that. And of course, that is connected to your wonderful discussion, of course, of this kind of new restaurants, kind of emerging restaurant in both Moscow and actually London, because this owners of this restaurant, they work in both cities and trying to reconstruct these experiences where actually all these people meet, and, you know, they're all friends, they're connected, they're not just friends, they're relatives, most of them. So just throwing that there. Thank you.
you want to take that, Michał? Because it was directed at you and it's quite a long question.
I'll be very brief in response, but that's a really excellent question. And you, I mean, you've said most of what I was going to say anyway, Masha, I think, because I mean, I got this from reading a recent interview in somewhere Meduza, I think, with Khrzhanovskiy, where he says that, where did you meet? He was asked, how did you get to know Adonyev? And he says, oh, it was via my friend Ilya Dimitrov, who is the co-founder of, który делает прекрасные ресторанные проекты в London. So, so it's this kind of tusovka that the avant-garde director knows the guy who runs the burger restaurants in London. It's this kind of, I mean, this is an earlier book actually of Jan Polski's, which had some interesting moments in it, this book Park Kultury, where he criticized this kind of lifestyle, this kind of reduction of intelligentsia to a kind of lifestyle, leisure, kind of bourgeois fetish in Moscow of the present day. So I suppose, yeah, it's a kind of comment about the political economy of this project and the kind of social economy of DAO, and how he was even pressed in that interview by the interviewer. Do you think it's an accident that you know the restaurateur who knows the oligarch who then knows somebody else? And Khrzhanovskiy kind of denies it. He said, no. I mean, it is an accident. It's not because we are in a tusovka. He denies it in an almost embarrassing way. This social network which underlies this film. And I suppose there was also a quote somewhere else. I can't remember which article it was in, because I read so many in the last week about DAO, about this kind of tusovka forming importance of DAO out of the set, that people would come from Moscow, right? And half of the kind of socialites of Moscow would visit DAO, and like Kapkov would go, and it's almost like this. There was an insinuation in this article that the Blagostroystvo of Moscow, this kind of Sovianian era transformation of Moscow, was done sort of in the image of DAO. And perhaps that's an overreading, but this kind of weird ecology where the director meets the burger, meets the lobster, meets the restaurateur, meets the oligarch, is important, I think, for the infrastructure of the project. But I mean, yeah, I think actually you said it better, so I'm just repeating what you said in a more.
Michał, there's another question while you're just talking about the set. Another question directed to you from Eugénie Makarova from McGill University in Montreal. Would you say that elements with overt, here she is, I think. Would you say that elements with overt sexual connotations in the Institute's architecture align well with Khrzhanovsky's project, or on the contrary, play a subversive role?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I didn't think of that when I was writing my paper. That thought didn't cross my mind that it could be subversive. But do you think it might be?
I mean, everything else about the project is so serious that it seems to me that an ironic element just kind of falls out of the general line of argument, and it caught my attention. So I wanted to get your opinion on it.
That's that's an interesting thought. I've thought actually about interviewing the set designer. So maybe that's one way to find out. But I mean, I kind of just read it as these sort of rather vulgar kind of sexist misogyny, this kind of the triviality of this sort of misogyny which underlies the whole project, and I kind of read the set as being just an element of that, and this is in a way that, with reference to the burger and lobster question, that actually the intellectual content of DAO is overrated a lot of the time, and the kind of its intellectual infrastructure is more to do with burger and lobster than it is to do with Karl Marx or anybody else. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting thought. Maybe it is subversive.
And I mean, it's especially interesting to look at it in the context of postmodern architecture, which I believe the whole set represents in a way.
Yeah.
Not so much constructivism or expressionism or any other specific architectural style, but mishmash of different stylistic elements that overall we can qualify as postmodern architecture. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for your question. That's really thought-provoking.
Okay, just time for two more then, maybe. Nikolai Duffield, you have a question you were going to ask? Yeah. Hi.
Yes. Hi, thank you. In my research as a graduate student at the University of Toronto, I've been interested in exploring the relationship between the DAU project to the European exploitation cinema tradition. And I was interested in getting the panelists' opinion on if there's an argument to be made to see Khrzhanovsky's Soviet totalitarian fictional reenactment in relation to perhaps Nazi exploitation, or maybe even left some of the Mondo film tradition in Italy. And are we seeing a kind of new period or a creation of a Soviet exploitation genre? And if so, what does this say about the post-1989-91 debate around anti-totalitarian discourse in contemporary Europe?
Who wants to take that? Eugénie? Okay,
I can try just a little bit of answer to this, because I find it quite interesting, this take. I would not per se compare the project itself to the productions you are mentioning. However, I think there is maybe a connection between the communication initially launched in Paris to some of the examples we have in the Mondo universe. Because this idea of selling it all for true, authentic, and also having this communication biting you back because people do believe you, because they do not watch films attentively, because just watching the films attentively would suffice normally to see that there is a lot of staging involved and that it's fiction, of course. But here, several times I thought about this, because we know some infamous examples in the history of cinema when directors or producers would sell things like saying it's all true and they would get problems because of this. So I think partially what is going on with DAU is kind of an echo to this kind of process. Well, I will stop there, but I think it's a clever way of looking at it. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have last question then is from Candice. Candice, you can.
Hi there, Rachel.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for such an amazing workshop and discussions. My question stems from the fact that the 4 films that I've seen, I saw not in chronological order. So I saw Chamber one first, Nikita Tanya, and that helped me very much because it was immediately, to me, the artifice of the situation, the stagedness, the theatricality of the sets came across very strongly, and that helped me focus very much on the intimacy and the actual themes of their conversations, which ask us to question our own sense of what the nature of relationship and love and possessiveness and jealousy and all these questions. As Eugénie said, I responded to them as classical, in a classical way. Then the next film I saw, for some reason, I thought, okay, I want to see what Nowy Człowiek is all about. And the seeing of the films as a theatrical and as indeed a multiple disciplinarian film approach made me respond not to the violence in the way I would normally respond, which is perhaps even switch off. But it also, again, gave me a way to look at the violence as a manifestation of the way the film embodies what it's trying to communicate. And the question in Nowy Człowiek for me was it says, what is it that, the question is not is man able to kill, but what is it that leads him to kill? What makes it, what is it that is important enough for him to kill? And of course, in this film, the man kills for an idea, and it's the idea of a new world, which we don't even perceive. And so, I then watched all the other films, and String Theory posed such extraordinary questions about the relationship between and parallels between art and science, and the peopling of these films with authentic scientists or artists or people who, by being in the film, are actually embodying the crossover between certain things. But the question of in there, through the black square and the using of the black square frame, saying that again, this drawing this very palpable parallel, it just led me to appreciate those questions of, is art for this? Is art requires mystification? Science requires mystification, and in the end, the character asks, "Well, what is beauty? Is it not красивое? Это строит мир, в котором мы хотим жить." And so this circularity then comes at the end of the film, where one has to give an example of what is that force that will actually lead you to do something that is degenerative, which devalues you. And he says, "Na primera," and then it's open. And so I think in a very classical way, it is true. These films lead you to ask you these questions, and I wonder, because I really appreciate what Natasha has presented to us, are we, is this our challenge? Are we prepared to watch these things? Are we prepared to accept people who might actually murder on set? Are we prepared to pay $3 to ask ourselves these aesthetic and ethical questions? I don't know. Sorry, that was rather long, but yes, I found all the questions posed in the film really fascinating, yeah.
Thanks, Candice. Maybe we can take that as a comment rather than a question, but if anyone wants to come back on it, feel free. Although I am very aware that we're sort of taking advantage of our participants' time. Normally at this point, we would take them out for dinner and buy them pizza and wine, but we can't do that this year.
Burger and lobster, rather.
Yeah, burger and lobster. Maybe when we can all meet again. Okay, so let's stop there. Thank you. I just want to thank you all really, effusively for giving up your time to talk to us about this tonight, and to our audience for sticking with us. And well, we can reconvene in January if you can take some more of this, and I'll send information out about that nearer the time. Thanks very much, everybody. Michał?
Quickly ask, is there a way, will you have